So just as an introduction, my name is Michael Cerny. I lead the Zurich Flood Resilience Program and as such also an alliance of overall 9 organizations from the humanitarian and civil society sector, from research and from us the private sector. And jointly we have developed the Post-Event Review Capability, and we'll be sharing what it is and how it works with you in the course of 3 webinars. We have shared a quick introductory video with you, but just if you want to see a face of who some of the presenters are, we have also Karen McClune, the Executive Director from ICET International, one of the key partners delivering on the PERC methodology jointly with us, and me today, and 2 more colleagues will be joining from ICET later on as well. So what are we trying to cover? Here's an agenda and an outlook of the webinar. As I said, it's 1 out of 3. We have 2 more coming up, the next one Friday at the end of this week, and then the next one the middle of next week. I'd like to provide a little bit of context what the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance is and how it helps build community flood resilience. Just that you understand that PERC is not something that is sitting in isolation, but actually that this is integrated in the full not-for-profit disaster risk reduction and humanitarian development program. We'll then review the learning objectives to ensure you have clarity what is expecting you in the course of the next 3 webinars. And that obviously also includes a bit of self-study and ensuring you keep up with the learning objectives. As discussed, there was a prologue, a PERC video that we shared with you earlier, just a 3-minute soundbite, really, that hopefully put you in the right mood for the learning sessions. I also explained very briefly why learning from disasters and big natural hazards events is important, and why it is important also at the global level in terms of disaster risk reduction initiatives going on, something that we call the Sendai framework. So then to dive in, at a glance, we'll look at why do we even do the post-event review capability, or PERC for short, and how is it different from other methodologies and other post-disaster assessments that already exist. We'll very often refer to the PERC manual that has been shared as a link and attachment in the email sent to you. And this will really be your good friend and study guide along the way. So please do refer to it and use it as frequently as you can. As I said, this is as much self-learning and supporting your learning in your own pace as much as it is a guided webinar. So we do expect you to do some self-study and reading between the webinar segments, and also to do a little bit of a mini case study that will help you get some practice and experience in conducting PERCs. We'll end today, hopefully, with the key PERC stepping stones. So just a quick intro into the elements that make up a PERC sequence, and we'll then hopefully have some time left for questions and answers and adjourn for the next webinar. So here's an outlook of that, and all fits together. So the second webinar will help you apply the PERC sequence and be much more familiar with the individual building blocks of what PERC is and how it comes together. And that's then the focus of webinar number 3. So once you imagine you have done all your research, you understand the event, you have all the puzzle pieces there, how do you put it together to develop the full picture? That will be also the moment to review what was in the PERC manual. So by then you should be fairly familiar in understanding what is in the manual and how to find it. And that will be the moment to present your own mini PERC case studies that you will have conducted. And we'll repeat the key ingredients to make sure we can successfully conduct a PERC study. So here are the learning objectives. So we'd like you to understand what PERC is, why we have PERC, why it exists, and how you can effectively become PERC trained. The second item is to learn to navigate, the stepping stones of the PERC manual and really use it as your guide. And I said, good friends that will help you accompany along the way. Now, many efforts are made to try and learn from disasters, but learning is really a big field and there's various approaches you can take. So we'd like to make sure we understand what the unique selling proposal for PERC is and how we differentiate ourselves and PERC from other initiatives that already exist. So the key learning element there is to be able to understand what makes PERC different. We then look at applying the PERC sequence. What do you need to do when to ensure you have success in providing PERC-like learnings at the end? And very briefly, to already now unveil a little bit those stepping stones of the PERC sequence, we need to look at how do we even identify an event that qualifies as being a PERC event. There's very many natural events happening out there, probably as we speak. Not all of them provide the equal opportunity for learning, and not all provide something different to what you already may have looked at many, many times before. So let's ensure we understand how to identify a PERC event. Secondly, every analysis starts with desk research and trying to understand what is already out there available that will help you build your puzzle pieces for a PERC. So how do you conduct PERC research? We then need to establish a suite of key research questions or hypotheses that we have that will guide us to the learning that we want to produce. And that's then also there to help us identify the interviews that we need to conduct and the interviewees or the key actors or players in the field of PERC. Then we approach the heart of conducting PERC research, and that's doing the field work. So how do you plan and then go out and conduct the field work itself? And then it's about putting this all on the table, scratching your chin and trying to understand how do we turn this into a product. This may be writing a PERC report in a more classical fashion, but a PERC product may be something else. It may be an event where you present your learnings. It may be more of a policy brief, so don't get too fixated in just providing a stack of papers. I think the learning and providing and activating the PERC learning may be something different than just a classical report. And in the end, how do you make use of the report? It's not just that we want this to be, between the two lids in a bookshelf. Sometimes it's not enough to present and talk to people, but how do we leverage the full power and the findings that PERC can provide so things actually change on the ground? Because ultimately the objective of a PERC is that the way an event turned into a disaster once is not repeated over and over again in the next events that may potentially provide the same ingredients of turning into a disaster. So once you understand a little bit the PERC sequence and the ingredients needed to deliver on each of those, let's ask ourselves, so how do we become what we call this forensic researcher? How do we really start scratching underneath the surface, dig out something that we don't quite understand, and then so what does that mean? How does this help us in digging deeper? So it is really a sequential process. It is not something where you can just have a 1, 2, 3, 4 step-by-step approach, but it needs for readjustment. It's really requiring you to ask open-ended questions that will help you get to the learning. But this type of forensic research is full of surprises, and it's full of these moments where you need to reflect and think, so how does this get me on to the next step that will then lead me to the learning? So this may sound quite challenging at the beginning, but I think it's just pointing out to the fact that we need to be open-minded, and it also can be an adventure that helps us to really generate learning that others wouldn't necessarily pick up. So we'll try to summarize this by identifying then the key challenges and the key opportunities with each PERC that you can do. And I think the $1 million question here is really, how do you find these gold nuggets of learning where others just report on facts and we say, how can we go beyond that? What is really the aha moment that somebody or a group of actors experienced that we can consistently bring together and then help society learn from this type of event? So with the learning objectives covered, let me provide you with a little bit of background on who we are and what we do. And as I pointed out in the learning objectives, the goal here is really to embed this in a wider context and highlight that PERCs are not being conducted in isolation, but there's a wider approach that in fact we've been running for the last 5 years that is present. So the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance is really a multi-sectoral partnership between civil society and the NGO world, the research and academic space, and the private sector. And we focus on finding practical ways to help communities, both in developing and developed countries alike, to strengthen their resilience to flood risk. So we work in the flood risk space, but our focus is not just avoiding property damage, but to ensure people can continue on their well-being path and can continue to develop and grow. And in that sense, and I will revisit this definition quite a few times over the duration of these webinars, here comes the definition of how we see resilience and what resilience means to us. So resilience is the ability of a system, a community, or a society to pursue their social, ecological, and economic development and growth objectives while they are being able to manage their disaster risk over time in a mutually reinforcing way. Now, while this may seem technical at first, what this really means is that development and risk management are not separate things. They're not mutually exclusive, but rather we need to make sure that we use risk-informed investment and infrastructure and social development to ensure people can achieve their goals and do not fall into a poverty trap, and we do not lose every gain of progress along the way if a natural hazard event materializes. We do this with the vision that floods have no negative impact on people's and businesses' ability to thrive. And if you look back at the definition above, this equally applies to the more commercial or business environment as well as non-profit environments or communities as a social fabric. So if you're coming more from a business commercial angle, this is equally important for you because it adds a new twist to commercial risk management, really, to highlight to businesses it's not just about keeping your property undamaged, but it's also making sure your employees can come to work, your customer base is there, and you can actually serve your customers in the way you want. And in that sense, the resilience space and our resilience definition equally applies to a commercial environment. And our North Star that we use to guide our approach is that we want to increase social, political, and financial investment in community-based flood resilience building through PPPs. And I want to stress here that it's very important that we look at investments and the things you can do to build flood resilience is not just limited to doing physical stuff such as building levees and producing more grey infrastructure. It's also looking beyond these more traditional and kind of concrete type approaches. And we have good evidence that this is what we need to do. So if we look at the overall numbers, we find that $1 invested in prevention, on average, as a real rule of thumb, saves $5 in future losses. So we have this 1 to 5 cost-benefit ratio of what we know the economic cases tell us. But if we look at where the numbers actually are, where currently a lot of the monetary investment is being spent, we see that only 13% currently go into pre-event resilience building and risk reduction, and over 87% are only spent once the event has already materialized, or in other words, 87% of the total go to post-event relief. And that is clearly the needle that we're trying to shift. If you're looking at some of the motivations and also some of the evidence, you see this here in fine print. So these are numbers that we have generated over the course of the last 5 years working as an alliance. And we really want to drive home this motivation that acting early and investing early is a good thing, and that it is actually not all that hard, and that this helps us with shifting the needle from acting as things have materialized to really act more in a early fashion. You see, this is not just Zurich alone. I mentioned ISET again as a very important key partner for the post-event review, but overall, at the Alliance and the partnership here, we have 9 partners collaborating, so a wide range of skills and expertise that come together here to help develop and deliver the solution. If you're looking for successes and numbers from phase 1, we have reached approximately 250,000 of beneficiaries directly through the work of the Alliance. We have a lot of knowledge products in which PERC also falls, so you see this in the bottom left box. And also a key on how we approach things here is to mention that we're open source. So we don't really have business secrets, or we have products that are only behind a paywall, but really want to make this knowledge and the toolbox that we have created as accessible as possible to anyone. So that's really the spirit in which also PERC sits. We try to be outspoken about this, so every now and then it doesn't hurt to win a couple of events. And I think the most prestigious recognition that we got was the Momentum for Change Award, embedded in the United Nations Climate Change Dialogue, so in the UNFCCC. Most of our funding, especially to our external partners, is provided by the Zurich Foundation, so the foundation from the business that has a very clear and distinct societal mandate, and we're talking in total numbers approximately 56 million Swiss franc over the course of the 10 years from phase 1, 2013 to 18, plus the following 5-year phase that we're now working in until 2023. We talked about this being a program in both developed and developing countries. So you see here a long list of places where we are active, and this goes from the global south to the global north, from East and Southeast Asia, also to the US, to Mexico, and other Latin American countries. So you see there is a global context here that we have, also both in terms of Zurich and non-Zurich business-focused countries. Wrapping up the context of where we operate as an alliance and flood resilience program, we have developed a flood resilience measurement tool that helps us understand what is this even flood resilience and how can we measure it. So that was one of the key deliverables that helps us understand what resilience is and how you can see this change over time. I mentioned the open source knowledge sharing approach. So we have currently portals in 3 languages that are globally available and open to anyone. So please do follow the links that you see here in the slide deck. And then last, obviously, we have PERC, our own take on how we can provide event level learning, why events turn into disasters. And that will be the first element of PERC that I would like to unpack, going into the details of what PERC is now. So PERC tries to learn from flood events and related catastrophes. So far, we have been working mostly on river floods, on flash floods, on flooding caused by hurricanes and other coastal events that have created waters that both are pushed on shore and create a backlog of waters in rivers. We've looked at very quick, sunshine type days, flooding that came out of the blue, to very long-standing 3 months at a time water in your community type events. But so far they have been flood focused. However, there is a good evidence here that our approach and the context in which PERC is embedded equally applies to other natural hazards perils. And in fact, as part of this webinar series, some of the participants are getting trained to look potentially also at wildfire and storm hazards. So that is important for you to keep in mind, that it's not just flooding that we look at, but the learning methodology and how we develop learning out of events that have happened equally applies to perils other than flooding. PERC is not focused on a single stakeholder or actor or jurisdiction or geographic boundary. But it's really trying to look across scales and sectors and across all elements of the disaster risk management cycle. So that's the other thing to keep in mind. We're not just focusing on understanding how preparedness worked or how the intervention piece has worked or how the recovery piece is coming together, but we're really looking how these elements of when and how you take action are distributed along how we segment the disaster risk management cycle in 5 key steps. And in the end, it's also not just looking at opportunities and providing recommendations based on what has worked well and therefore leads to potential further improvement. It is equally important to amplify successes, because very often what has worked in one place is not necessarily scaled or communicated to another place that might benefit from such knowledge. So I think we have equally an important message here that, sharing successes from what has been learned in disaster events is equally important as pointing out what has not worked so well. So this has been happening since 2013 when we started the program, and in total 13 PERC studies have been conducted around the globe, out of which 3 are based in the US. The very first one, actually conducted by ICET in collaboration with the Red Cross, was a study on floods in Boulder. Then in 2015, we reviewed the remnants of Hurricane Joaquin that turned into the South Carolina flooding. And then we have looked at the remnants causing massive, standing flooding in the area of Harris County and the Houston metropolis in what was Hurricane Harvey. And currently aligned or following on from this webinar is the study that we're planning to roll out to look at PERC Florence. So revisiting the learning objectives, we have looked a little bit at the context, and we'd like you now to familiarize with the PERC methodology and how we can use the guidance material that we already have. So really just quick, I don't want to go too much into the details of a global framework, but obviously learning at the global level is a key element, and it's actually stated in probably the most prominent framework that exists at the global level to promote disaster risk reduction and resilience building, which is the Sendai framework embedded in the United Nations organization UNISDR, which occupies itself with disaster risk reduction. So there's 2 priorities in their terms of reference that directly mention how important it is to provide learning. So on the left, you see that sharing expertise, knowledge, post-disaster reviews, and lessons learned are an integral part of what Sendai does. And on the right-hand side, you see that we need to use post-disaster reviews as opportunities to enhance learning and public policy. So they're looking also a bit in, what do you do with that learning and what do you try to change with that? And very importantly, there is no such thing as a natural disaster. So I might pick you up on that every now and then if I hear it, but I personally do truly detest the term natural disaster. And the reason for this is that it really leaves a very strong fatalistic flavor. If the disaster is natural, then what can you possibly do about it? So in fact, what we need to look at is the chain of events that make what is a typically very natural event, a river carrying a bit more water, the ocean coming a bit more onshore, those types of processes. These natural processes then causing consequences in the developed world in the sense of touching human infrastructure, touching human livelihoods, touching the humans themselves, and only that will then lead to the disaster, being turned into disaster from the natural process. There is even a full book on this terminology, natural hazards, but unnatural disasters. And it's looking again also at the motivation of being effective in what you do to prevent events from turning into disaster. So if you do have, an interest in doing more reading, this is open knowledge as well, and you'll see the link here at the bottom of the slide. So the takeaway message here is really that we do have a choice. Do we want a natural event to turn into a disaster or not? So this is being illustrated by some of the pictures we have taken across the programs that we have been running. So it's only when a natural process touches the human infrastructure that a disaster may unfold. And this is what you can see here in the screen. And again, very importantly, it's not just the physical property that you've seen in the first picture, it's also memories. It's the unquantifiable, or it's the unmonetizable that often gets destroyed and leaves the biggest footprint in terms of the human impact of what has happened and what has made a natural event turn into a humanitarian disaster. We have also a choice whether it's just grey infrastructure and ad hoc or ex post measures, such as sandbags. So the second thing that I truly detest is sandbags being offered as a solution, because, and I apologize that I didn't find a better picture, but it really explains it so well here. So this was a display at a flood protection conference somewhere and sometime in Germany, and what they ask you is to assume you need to build a 100-meter long levee, 1 meter high, and you have 1 hour of advance early warning. What does it take you to achieve that? If you're using sandbags to build the levee, what you see is on the left-hand side, so a very busy picture. You need 350 people in 11 American school buses. You need 14,000 sandbags delivered by 47 trucks, and you need 1 goulash cannon to feed the army that you need to have in the field. Equally, if you're using a much more modern, technological, and just adapted solution, such as a mobile levee that you can just roll out and that is filled with water, you need 4 people, you need 1 trailer that you can carry in your very regular car. You need 3 pumps that will help you pump the water into them, and you have your 100-meter long levee, 1 meter high in 1 hour. So it's a choice. What do we do and how do we do it? And these are exactly some of the reasons why you want to do a PERC. In particular, because some of these people who could best profit from the knowledge don't necessarily have it. And I emphasize the sandbag example as we were doing our very first PERC in Germany after the flooding in 2013. This levy of sandbags kept coming back to me until I just asked the counter question at some point. So why sandbags? Why do we keep talking about this? And the answer was very simply, they didn't know what else was out there, although solutions like this obviously have existed and have been proven to work for quite some time. So it's still about also communicating what works as much as what doesn't work. So then at a glance, if you ever are in the need to deliver an elevator pitch of what PERC is, here are 5 bullet points trying to summarize it. So PERC is a flexible method. We don't know what we find until we actually go through our process and the PERC stepping stones. And we try to analyze root causes of why events turn into a disaster. So it's really this nexus of a natural process that either can harm or does not harm people, and then understand why these consequences, if they do, become so disastrous. We work and try to answer at the event level what has worked well and where opportunities are for further improvement. So see, it's both looking at the bad and the good. And in our sense, it's really a unique forensic investigation method at the societal level, putting people at the heart. So our questions do not always circle around how expensive, how much money, that kind of thing, but also trying to understand how it impacts people and how it has impacted or changed their lives. It is flexible in the sense that we can adapt the input, what type of questions, what type of interviews do we conduct, and also outputs. So it may be a report, it may be an event, it may be a very different type of product that we deliver. We try to cover events that provide opportunity for learning. So we're trying not to repeat more of the same as we go along conducting more PERCs, but every event that really qualifies as a PERC event should provide something new, something that hasn't been explored yet. And as you have seen from the context in terms of the global framework, we are supporting a global mission to generate and share learning. Likewise, I tried to point out very briefly what PERC is not. This is not just to ensure we understand what's in scope and what is not in scope, revisiting the earlier statements that, what we have seen already, but it's also understanding that you shouldn't be afraid that a PERC is never really going to be complete. You can continue asking questions. You can continue scratching further and digging deeper. You'll never reach 100% of understanding an event and why an event turned into a disaster fully. I think this is about the 80-20 rule as much as doing the best that you can to deliver with the resources at hand. And that should also guide what you are trying to achieve. So think about your homework that we'll be giving to you in terms of the mini PERCs. Of course, that is, very quick and dirty, and still you should be able to tap into the 2-3 key main questions that you want to address and provide the learning for that. And in that sense, a PERC will never ever be complete, but it can provide some very interesting learning nuggets, these gold nuggets that we mentioned earlier. Secondly, PERC is not a performance review. So we're not operating on behalf of someone to assess whether they have done or not done the right thing. It is also not to attribute fault or blame. So it's not comparing, this is the guide that tells the emergency operations should do X, but they did Y, and therefore they have not done what they should have been doing. That doesn't necessarily lend itself to good societal level learning. So it's not attributing fault or blame, but much more about trying to gain the trust of those people that you talk to and interview so that they can tell you the really interesting things that they always wanted to tell, but probably that didn't fit in the framework of their own performance review, their own event analysis that they would be typically doing. And it's also not an assessment or a report or a product that we do on behalf of someone else. We really want to be independent in the sense that as we set out on our PERC journey, we don't know yet what we're going to find, and we should be open to any type of findings that we will encounter along the way. And here's why we call this a forensic research, because it is very much comparable to a detective's work when literally you have a dead body found on the street and it's about finding out who the murderer was. So in this case, again, it is not following your idea that you have that somebody is already the murderer. That would bias you and not provide this independent approach. But you really need to follow your leads, and one thing then will guide you to the next until you have as complete a puzzle as you possibly can that will help you understand what has happened and what has turned an event into a disaster. So let's revisit a bit more in depth what flood resilience is and how PERC is embedded in our concept. So resilience is really something rich. It's a multifaceted concept that you cannot explain in a singular, linear way. There are many definitions and ideas out there about what resilience is. And then we have created our own approach that is not really plucked out of the blue, but that is trying to combine the best models and most established concepts that work for us that already exist and have actually existed for quite a while. And we have embedded our resilience approach and combined it with the approach that we take to support communities become more resilient to flood risk. So what that means, again, is that we need to be flexible and open to finding ways of what builds resilience rather than come in with a preconceived idea of concept. It's levees that you need, or it's managing your forests differently. We simply don't know until we start digging, and that's what we want to use PERC as a conduit for. Dig, assess what you find, and then process so that it turns into learning. Very importantly, resilience is not about being more prepared. Resilience is not just responding better or responding faster. And resilience is also not just protecting communities by fighting the water, by separating the human infrastructure and keeping the water somewhere else. Again, coming back to, levees and dikes and engineering alone will fix the problem. Engineering will be an important element of how you do that, but it needs to be embedded and integrated into a wider resilience concept. And as such, resilience is the ability of a system, community, or society to pursue their development and growth objectives while managing disaster risk over time in a mutually reinforcing way. So apologies for the repetition, but I think that's really a point that we want to drive home. It's really this richness and flexibility of the concept that we need to tap into. Let's look a little bit in more detail what we mean by achieving your development and growth objectives. Everybody has ideas and wishes and hopes for the future, and that's what we mean by being able to pursue their goals and growth objectives. So that might mean an individual, a child coming out of a poor or marginalized family, really wants to get a degree, wants to get a good education so they can do their job where they can achieve their potential to the fullest. It may also mean a household that wants to be able to extend their home business operations by buying a different vehicle, a better vehicle, or even a vehicle at the very first time. For an SME, it may mean that by using new technology, different machinery, or expanding their product range, they can expand production and be seen and be present in the market very differently. And likewise, at the community level, it may mean moving the community ahead by maybe electrifying and moving away from cooking stoves at home to provide better well-being inside the community. So it may be any or all of these which we mean by achieving your development and growth objectives. And the question then is, if there is a flood event, are you able to achieve your goals? And are you able to do that in your planned timeframes? This is very material because for us, resilience doesn't just mean can you bounce back to the same place where you were before the flood event, if a flood event has happened, because this is just going back to where you were. So this is not being reactive and recover, but resilience is really looking forward and making sure that you get where you wanted to get in the first place. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the concept, but I just want to decompose the terminology of risk a little bit. So what is the definition of risk? So risk is composed of three elements. The first one is the hazard, the natural process. And again, be reminded that a natural hazard is not a natural disaster. The natural hazard is the process that is taking place by nature, but it's the humanitarian disaster that will evolve if you complete the risk equation. So the hazard in itself just means there might be a high possibility of flooding from a river, a coastline, or any type of water body. But as you can see in this first sketch, there is not yet any infrastructure in harm's way, and therefore there is no risk despite the natural hazard. But if you multiply hazard with the exposed asset, so people or the built environment in harm's way, then that's where you start building up on the risk equation. So if infrastructure and people flood, then you start seeing risk. However, the third element in the equation that you need to assess is how do the various vulnerabilities of the built environment interact with the hazard. And when we say vulnerability, there's actually three elements that we look at in terms of vulnerability. There is the more traditional physical vulnerability. How quickly will a house be destroyed? How much water can your agricultural field sustain? But we're also looking at economical and social vulnerabilities in the sense that people who don't know how to swim suffer very differently from people who know how to swim. that people who are marginalized, living in the poorest or in the most, inappropriate places to deal with flood hazard, will suffer unequally and will suffer, proportionally in a very much increased way compared to those people who can either financially afford or have the social status to live in a different way. So it's only if you bring these three elements of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability together that you create risk overall. So what's different with PERC? Again, we're focusing on the learning. So this is not a performance review, as I said earlier. It's also not a statement of facts. So what we want to do is deep dive into the relevant flood events or other perils, as we discussed, and look at tangible products. So we provide the flood expertise that you can then turn into a consistent and consolidated insight into the event, and make sure you're consistent to the extent that you can have a series of publications. So in our case, we have turned them into a Zurich Risk Nexus series that is then accessible through our knowledge platforms. So you can identify almost a PERC brand. So if you open a PERC report or you go to a PERC event, we will guide you through that learning process of not just stating what has happened in an event, but look then at the context, provide explanations how hazard, vulnerability, and exposure came together, and explain what we found and what we learned. The knowledge platform where all the PERC sits, we want to make accessible to decision makers. Again, one of the aims that we have with this is provide incentives while acting early and investing in the ex-ante, so before the risk materializes in the ex-ante risk reduction space is beneficial over just acting post-event. It's open source, so we haven't charged for this product as we speak so far. So this is really part of our mandate and where we believe we add value, and we create a footprint of being seen as a thought leader. But of course, also in terms of our own business within Zurich, we believe this is a great knowledge transfer internally to some of our key functions. So this clearly helps improve the claims process, because inherent to claims should be learning why an event has actually turned into a claim, but also likewise for underwriting in terms of the contract setting and the line setting. And of course, our friends from the risk engineering function who live and breathe prevention every day. So surely there is an alignment here with our risk engineering colleagues. There is a to be decided in the sense that if you want to, you potentially could turn this into a service for key business partners for some of the large infrastructure handlers. So potentially there is a commercial element to this, but at the moment we are providing our PERCs free of charge, and again, as I said, to society. So we're serving a variety of audiences. And our key aim here is to be an independent open source of risk insight related to big flood events. So let me briefly stop here, stop sharing the screen, and try to unmute all the lines, if I'm able to do that. Unmute all. So from our end, lines should be open at this point in time, and people can unmute individually themselves if there are any questions or needs for clarification. So lines open. I haven't received any questions at this point, and I'm also checking the chat box where there are no outstanding questions. So if we have Karen, Hanmani, or Rachel on the line, I'm just reaching out to you to see if there's anything you want to add or rephrase as part of the PERC team at this point in time.
I don't, Michael. I think it's been pretty clear and comprehensive.
Great. I'll ask for a second round of any potential questions before I unmute the line once more. Is there any need for clarification from the participants, please? That doesn't seem to be the case, and a few chat elements coming in saying that this is fairly well understood, so thank you for that. So let me click through the boxes. I will mute all lines at this point. Now we'll move back to sharing my screen. I will try to resume the presentation. Good. So hopefully you now see the slide of the 5 capitals, which is one of our so-called lenses or directions, how you can look at resilience. What I explained to you is a very rich, diverse and flexible approach to understanding hazard exposure and vulnerability. So the 5 capitals originally hail from the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, or SLF for short, that was developed by the UK's DFID development institution, probably some close to 40 years ago now. And the 5 capitals really make up 5 complementary elements that help you understand resilience in one direction. So the 5 complementary capitals are obviously physical capital, in the sense that you have things or infrastructure produced by economic activity from other capitals, and that may mean critical infrastructure, meta infrastructure such as roads and bridges. It may be houses and commercial properties, residential properties, equipment and machinery, but it's also crops and livestock, so everything that stands up in the physical environment. Secondly, we have social capital, so the relationships, networks and bonds that aid action. So how do you work together? How do you communicate? How do you exchange and facilitate linking up and therefore sharing and developing ideas and resources? So this is really looking at how people interact, especially in our case at the community level. Thirdly, we look at the individual. So the human capital comprises knowledge, education, skills, and health, amongst others. We have financial capital, so obviously the monetary aspect, the level, variability, and diversity of income sources and access that you have to financial resources that help you with your staying on your well-being path. And lastly, we have natural capital, very important that we shouldn't forget we are part of the environment. So we have a natural resource base, including the land that gives us the productivity and the actions to sustain it. And that includes the land surface, water, air, and other resources that help us sustain our livelihoods. So the 5 capitals is one potential angle, or as we call it, lens of resilience, how you can look into what we describe as a Rubik's Cube. So you need to turn and move around the surfaces to get the full picture. The second one are the 4 properties of a resilient system. So originally, they come from earthquake engineering, looking at the physical environment of complex systems, but we believe it equally applies also to the more human and social element in which we work as the Flood Resilience Alliance. The first of the R's being robustness, or the ability of, let's assume, an infrastructure to withstand a shock. So that is your sturdily built bridge, that is your road that can cope with being flooded. Those are your drinking water and wastewater pipes that will not break if they are immersed in floodwaters and the like. The second approach to a resilient system is providing redundancy or functional diversity. So going back to the bridge example, do you have a second bridge that helps you get across the river if the first bridge is failing? We then have resourcefulness or inventiveness, so the ability to mobilize and solve a puzzling problem in the moment when you need it. So in this case, under the threat of an event materializing and turning into a disaster. So how can you solve a puzzle problem quickly when needed? And last but not least, we have rapidity. or the ability to contain losses and recover and act in a timely manner. So in that sense, that is your response services that are able to reach the scene of the incident quickly and when and how it is needed. And the third element of how we look at this rich and diverse concept of resilience is the disaster risk management cycle, or DRM for short. If you focus for a moment only on the left half of the slide, this is restating the well-known but not so often followed fact that prevention is better than cure. But how do we do this? So again, how do we leverage on this ambition that if I invest $1 now, it helps me avoid $5 in future losses? But what is my motivation to act early rather than wait? And that's where you can turn your attention to the right half of the slide, rather than wait until the coconut has fallen onto your head. So a research colleague of ours that developed this sketch really calls this risk management with coconuts. But equally, it is really just a 5-element circle that you see on the top element of this right half of the slide. So it's not just focusing on preparedness. Am I ready, as I get 1 hour or 1 day advance notice to act should the storm come on shore and flood my property? It's not just, am I able to respond as the wind has pushed in the window and the water is flooding in? And of course, as we mentioned, it's not just, can I build back and recover to where I was earlier? So the two very often underestimated elements are prospective and corrective risk reduction as 2 elements of taking mitigation action. And that's where the coconuts come into play. Prospective risk reduction is really making use of your space element that you have. And this is particularly true for natural hazards, which are spatial hazards in the sense that you have a choice to build in the river valley or build up high. And therefore, do you even get in a place where the coconut could fall onto your head? The prospective risk reduction is thinking ahead as you do development and try to understand how to avoid creating new risk. It's putting my $1 million investment either in harm's way or not in harm's way by doing a very classical hazard and risk assessment up front before you take decisions. And I'm emphasizing this so much because obviously this in our eyes is the earliest, probably best, and very often most cost-effective way of dealing with risk. The second element is corrective risk reduction. So this is recognizing that you have built your development already in harm's way, but before the disaster even is visible on the horizon, you try to take preventive action. So corrective risk reduction is recognizing you're sitting underneath the coconuts and think about what can I do before it's even starting to move and giving you the evidence that it might fall on your head. So in this case, it's providing a clamp or providing you with a tarpaulin under which you can be safe should the coconut fall down. The third element around this preparedness is really only acting as you see, oh, this coconut is really ripe and it could fall on my head any moment at this time. Getting ready, crouching and preparing and kind of flexing your body so that you could run at the moment the coconut is falling down. So you see the time element here that we are playing through. And then the response is, well, it's happened. You have a black eye and feeling not particularly well. And can we get the ambulance in time? Can we get it to the beach where you're lying? And can we help you immediately in the response operations? And then the last is, as you're getting, stitched up, you're thinking about, so where do I go back to the beach? Do I go back underneath the same tree? Do I go back underneath another tree that has another set of ripe coconuts? Or how can I avoid just doing the same thing again? So you see the time element playing out here, but it's important to see that this is a circular element much more than a linear element, in the sense that after an event is really just before the next event, and as such, with the response and reconstruction cycle, the next spin of the cycle starts, and you can equally now look at prospective risk reduction, corrective risk reduction, and preparing ahead of time. So these are three different lenses or approaches you can take to tap into the richness and diversity of this resilience concept, and we look at it jointly. So it's 5 C's, 4 R's, the DRM cycle, and other lenses that you can really imagine as well that help you understand and unpack this richness of resilience. So let's now look into what this approach and following the PERC sequence has helped us do. So here we try to deconstruct a little bit the key findings that we have come across so far, or in other words, what have we learned using this approach? So far, just a very few select examples, and I'm trying to point out here that these examples do not come from a singular event or a singular PERC study that we have conducted, but actually are some of the things that constantly fall out if you compare the 13 PERC events that we have done so far side by side, and also provide the evidence that this truly global approach works, because actually it's not all that different what happens in Nepal, what happens in Mexico, or what may happen in Germany or the US during and after a flood event. So while some of the geographic, cultural, and development context may be quite distinct in the geographies we have conducted the PERCs, the core findings are actually not all that different. So the first one is what we have also seen with the management with DRM management with coconuts theme, is that disaster risk management is playing catch up to an increasingly larger exposure to natural hazards. More people are potentially threatened by flooding today than there were 10, 20, 50 years ago. There's a lot of urbanization going on, especially in places where urban areas are increasingly subject to riverine, delta, or coastal floodings. So if we look at the map where cities are growing, they are growing in much flood-exposed areas. And how we manage these risks is not keeping up with the actual exposure growth. The evidence of cost benefits of this 1 to 5 scheme, $1 invested in ex-ante measures saves $5 on average in future losses, is not just something that we have seen doing our community programs, but we have also seen it come out, so to say, the other end as we analyze big events using the PERC methodology. So we clearly see that globally the spending on response is far, far greater than the investment being put into the risk reduction strategies. And where money is invested in prevention, it goes more towards the physical element, grey infrastructure, levee type constructions, rather than very often the more cost effective and probably also more sustainable risk management solutions, such as spatial planning, environmental planning, and what we call comprehensive no-regret solutions. So let me explain briefly what we mean by no-regret solutions. A no-regret solution is an investment or a strategy that you implement to build flood resilience that will provide benefits regardless of whether the next big event comes along or not. So as an illustration, if you build a 1 mile long, 2 meters or 6 feet high levee, that will only provide you a benefit if actually there is a reasonable amount of floodwater being contained by the levee. Otherwise, it mostly will provide you actually negative consequences in the sense of you're changing the natural environment, you might change the biodiversity in the river, and it's clearly not a nice view to look at, and that grey levee is just standing there not doing much on its own. Whereas a no-regret solution as providing parks that can also act as flood pathways in the city provide a benefit to the citizens because it's greening the city, it's actually cooling the city, so we have here the climate change effect as well, and it will provide the flood benefit if the flood event comes along. But you not just need to wait for that one, for the park to provide a benefit to what the city needs. We also see, and that's another reason why we shouldn't focus our efforts and our investment solely on grey infrastructure, because we see this very consistently and very clearly across the board, infrastructure protection already in place, such as levees, provide a false sense of security. When we looked at the flooding following Storm Desmond in the central United Kingdom a few years ago, that was the most consistent picture that we got from all the investigations that we did. The Environment Agency provided levees that were fit for the 100-year so-called flood return period. We'll talk about this in just a minute. But people saw the levee, they felt safe, they did nothing else to understand how to deal with flood situations. The levee was overtopped, and actually we argue that the consequences of this type of flooding were actually more devastating than had the flood levee not been in place, because then at least to some extent it's obvious that there is a river that could overtop and need different types of approaches. So for me, the takeaway here is, one, grey infrastructure is something that you very critically need to look at in terms of the costs and the benefits that they provide. But secondly, they're just seen as providing the single solution, and if that fails, then you have no further lines of defense available. And still, with all the evidence that we have that preventing is good, even building back better is difficult, and very few incentives, both on the policy as well on a very practical implementing side, exist that help you learn your lessons and include resilience into your rebuilding process. And I have visited many, many customers across the PERCs that we have conducted who literally said to the claims adjuster, you know what this looks like today, you've been here 2 years ago, you've been here 10 years ago, and the flood consequences are again the very same. So how can we at least, use the low-hanging fruit by providing learning so that the building back better can take place? We have summarized all of this from our 13 PERC events in what we call a PERC medley report. It's accessible at the bottom through the link that we have. And I'll showcase this in just a moment. Just to wrap this slide up, the other element important to look at is marginalized, most vulnerable, socially, groups that are moved to the side are often neglected before, during, and after disasters. So they are those suffering the most. So we also need to look at the stratification of social groups and support those who are the weakest link and then, who need support as much as they can. So I hope I can now just bring up the PERC medley report. It should be hiding somewhere here, I guess. Which one? Is it one? Thank you. So hopefully that is sharing the screen as well. So here is a report that we have published last summer that is really trying to summarize all of what we have learned through the 13 PERC events so far. It's really providing a short, concise 10-page document where, in effect, the bullet points that I highlighted to you earlier are explored in a little bit more detail. So you find here our cumulative key findings, and in fact in this blue box here you kind of see the bullet points that I have summarized in the slide before as well. So if somebody wants a quick access of everything that has been learned so far, it can be found in this so-called PERC medley report. So, continuing, non-structural elements such as planning and resilience building are sound investments, and not only so for public officials and governments, also for businesses. So some of the key questions that we should address is, how do businesses and those who hold the purse string make decisions based on whether they attribute cost only to risk management, or whether they also see risk and the materializing consequences as a cost. So that is ultimately one of the motivators. You need to be able to explain how it is beneficial to put your investments into this space. We also know that early warnings and awareness building initiatives are effective, and in fact they can reduce losses of up to 40% by just building a simple enough, straightforward early warning systems. We've seen this both in Nepal and in the UK, so again you see across very different contexts. What we also find is knock-on effects, and that's really the interesting approach where the PERC methodology comes in so handy, using your forensics and letting yourself be guided by the evidence that you pick up along the way. The knock-on effects, especially of critical public infrastructure, is really often overlooked. So how does a railway bridge lead to the shutdown of the complete railway system? How does that then relate to a reconfiguration of the transportation of goods? And how does that potentially change your whole supply chain situation also for a business? So these knock-on effects are something that we often trace or try to trace during a PERC to understand where was the root cause and what were then the downstream knock-on consequences. Something that might be very simple to say, but actually in terms of how reviews of events are being done is not that straightforward. Disasters do not respect jurisdictional boundaries. So we do not carry out PERCs just within one county or one city precinct, but we really need to look at the event level. Where has it started? Where has it ended? And that goes across boundaries. And in Central Europe, we have seen that this goes through as much as 5 or 6 national boundaries, from the source of the flood to the last element of the consequences. And we briefly talked already about the 100-year, return period. So event return periods and the language associated with flood frequencies are often and widely misunderstood. If we hear, oh, this was a 1,000-year event, we are often led to believe that now we don't need to do anything for the next 999 years because the event is not going to come back. And this is just plain wrong. And it's wrong for 2 reasons. One is that this is a statistical average that very often is built on a small, sparse, and widely varying data set. So if you just have 3 big flood events in your past history of your recording flood gauge, that really doesn't tell you much if you start interpolating these data points. So there is a huge uncertainty associated with these numbers that are being communicated. The other one is really just how you look at that number. And if we flip the 100-year return period on its head, it doesn't mean anything but that there is a 1% chance of this event occurring in any given year at any given measurement point, really. So if your left bank has flooded, that doesn't necessarily tell you much about the right bank, or if the one river upstream in the city has flooded, that doesn't necessarily mean you're safe from the other river flooding. So these things are really independent and actually more frequent than we tend to believe. So again, the 100-year return period being the 1% annual chance, which is my a bit more preferred method of saying it, that's actually a high probability. You having a 1% probability of being run over by a car each year, I'm sure you would revise your strategy on how you're crossing roads. So somehow, especially with natural hazards, we tend to believe that this 100-year flood or this 100-year avalanche, as we're currently experiencing the situation in Europe, is something that is not relevant and not, frequent enough to deal with. But actually it's a very relevant and very frequent hazard compared to other things that we deal with on a daily basis. There's a quick video for those who are internal to Zurich on Zurich Workplace, a video called Return Periods Explained. I'll just try to do this with a little bit more detail on a, kind of a back of a napkin explanation that I recorded a couple of months earlier. And the first line of defense is not your levy, but is being proactive. It's about planning. It's about thinking ahead and regulating your building and development landscape so that you avoid the creation of new risk. So again, it's where do you put your new infrastructure? In particular, where do you put your new care or nursing home as we're looking particularly how vulnerable people might deal with the situation. So again, it's bringing the hazard, the exposure, the exposed assets, and the vulnerability of these assets and people to the hazards together in this equation of risk. Another illustration why levies are not the preferred method. They are ugly, and as I said, they very often provide a lot of contention before they're even being built. And I'm sure the residents in these homes had a lot of, feelings about this being the preferred solution to protect from flooding in this German city that you see here on the top of the picture. So conversely, here's the park and the small stream that can act as a second flood bypass to take up actually quite a lot of excess water from the river that is also flowing through this German city. So these are two real examples of what we highlighted during the PERC conducted in Germany in 2013. So at this point, I'd like to point the attention to the PERC manual. Even repeating myself here that the PERC manual is open source as well. So if you talk to partners, other organizations, and they're interested to get their hands on the manual, it is available both from our Zurich PERC page as well as from our Flood Resilience Alliance's portal. And if you want to look for a further search functionality of PERC solutions and recommendations, there's the shortcut here, floodresilience.net/PERC. And I mentioned that a series of studies and summaries to highlight the the elements that fall out consistently in terms of recommendations across all PERCs. They also have been published in a variety of literature. So at this point, it is really demo time, and I hope that works by going back to a browser and going through the PERC manual together with you. And I'm looking to my colleague who's helping me set this up, David. So where would I find the PERC manual? Is that already open somewhere? Or shall I just download it from here? PERC manual. So just bear with me for a second here. As it is loading, I hope it is coming up, so apologies for the small delay. And maybe we can get to it through another way here. Great. It's quicker. So hopefully you now all see the PERC manual being displayed on the screen. So this should be your one-stop shop if you're looking for any guidance, what a PERC is, why you should do it, how it works, and unpacking the methodology for you. It is roughly broken into 6 chapters. First one is the motivation, why we conduct the PERC. Then we look at the framework. We look at the report structure. So what is, an example for an end product, and how do we structure it to best bring the learning to the fore? And then we look at the methodology. So what do you need to do step by step to get there? So this, step sequence about doing a PERC that we discussed earlier. That will bring you up to a point where you need to say, okay, I've investigated so far and I've collected so much insight and potentially already learning as well. That then leads to the question, how do I put it together? How can I distill this, write this up, create a conducive learning product that brings it all together? And we'll conclude in terms of revisiting again why this is so important. There is an overall joint glossary that helps you understand some of the key terms that we use. You will see the disaster risk management cycle is featuring in here. We're looking at the capitals and some of the other lenses of how you can view resilience. But we also look at some of the interesting elements that we have seen come out of PERC, such as this over-reliance of a single defense grey infrastructure solution. So there is actually a term for that. It is called the levee effect. So when the presence of a flood protection structure is, making you believe you're safe in the shadow of this structure, that this actually increases risk rather than reduce risk. That is a term that has been coined by a particular researcher already some 25 years ago. So do review the glossary to familiarize yourself with some of the key terms. I'll jump across the motivational piece, why conduct a PERC. I would assume that if you aren't motivated by now to keep listening, then you have dropped off the webinar phone lines. And dive right into the framework. So there's a couple of framing elements that are worthwhile trying to read up on in the guide. The first one will be the focus actually of the second webinar at the end of this week, when we look at the various interacting components of a resilient system. So at the end of the day, we need to understand that we are embedded, as a wheel or a set of turning wheels in a wider system that is governed by laws, regulations, and cultural norms, and that is executed by these agents, so people and organizations. And we want to understand how they interact with each other. So that's one element that will help you understand how the PERC methodology will provide you with the necessary instruments to dig into the learning. We'll review the 5 capitals in this manual. So here again you see how we can unpack this rich and maybe sometimes complex aspect of resilience. And that will then help you understand how you will structure your toolbox, so to speak, to provide the learning product that you want to generate at the end of your PERC study or PERC research. So typically what for us has worked well in the past is obviously providing an exec summary. Sometimes it's also worthwhile thinking about a small breakout, smaller product that you can provide independent of a bigger report. We provide an introduction explaining why PERC as a methodology and why this particular study is important. And that's also where we explain that, an event does not necessarily need to turn into a humanitarian disaster. So why do we want to study this one? To help us understand why it did. Section 1 of a typical PERC report is then explaining the physical context. So what has this type of event been? How did it manifest meteorologically, hydrologically, etc.? And it's a little bit of a framing how such an event compares to previous events or what was expected and is being seen at the moment in terms of changes to frequency, severity and intensity of these types of disasters over, say, for example, the last 2 decades. The interesting thing is that this for us is section 1 or the first chapter of a PERC report. And that's where we get started really in terms of unpacking how the event turned into a humanitarian disaster. Do a little bit of research and Googling yourself, and you will find that very often, and I would argue 90% of those claiming to provide learning from any big disaster event stop at this point. I've seen many, including a big national level review of the 2013 Germany flood disaster, just explain how big the event was, what type of measurements they have seen, what type of losses they have seen, and really just what others call also admiring the numbers and admiring the problem. And maybe 1 or 2 pages out of a 200-page report that looked a little bit at, oh, and maybe this is what could have been done differently, or maybe here's something interesting. So 2 pages out of a 200-page report looking at learning is simply not enough. So we want to ensure we focus on the learning and typically keep the physical context section short. The second section is then trying to bring together this approach of understanding agents, institutions, and social norms by looking at the socio-economic disaster landscape. So we try to understand a little bit who are the groups of people, the services and the functions that are present and are vulnerable for such a type of disaster, and what are the underlying factors that make this happen, and trying to understand what has happened in the context of this geography where the event took place to promote risk and vulnerability reduction. So overall, we try to provide a map or a sense checking of who are the actors and what are they doing in the context. Section 3 is then looking at effectively a first attempt bringing together the event side of things and the disaster side of things, but staying at the observational and factual level. So describing what has happened, describing how the event led to consequences, how impacts of the disaster have been observed, how preparedness, response, recovery operations, and also to a certain extent earlier corrective and prospective risk reduction efforts were or were not taken, and how they potentially could have helped in this context. And only then, that's where you start looking at the learning. So who is learning? Where is learning being accomplished? And is that learning really sitting in a silo that, it's some research that we can put on a shelf and we have analyzed the event? Or is it actually being incorporated into actions and ways that will improve the future outcomes should the same type of disaster or the same severity of disaster occur again? We then split our more assessment and analysis part of a PERC report into 2 sections, and we do this for very good reason. So the first one, the key insights, is really looking at what has worked and what hasn't worked, but without providing already a narrative, what a recommendation could be. So for those on the call who work in risk assessment, risk engineering, or the prevention space, this is very much segmenting your report into your findings and then your risk improvement advice or the recommendations that you provide to a customer. So one is looking at the insights and the learning. One is then rephrasing it with a set of actors or a key audience in mind so that you provide a very factual and practical narrative how this could help lead to action in the future. So recommendations should always be actionable, easy enough to carry out, and address questions of equity and justice. They should be realistic, so not hypothetical, but they should take into account the current context in which you're operating. And again, it would be good if we can look at the most marginalized and vulnerable groups in society as well. Again, highlighting that we don't just want to focus on what has gone wrong, but also identify what has really worked well. Very often this is overlooked. Nobody is asking in a disaster what has worked. Actually, you should, because there's a great deal that others who have not lived through that disaster and therefore do not know what works well can learn from it as well. The 4th chapter of the PERC manual then explains the methodology and the approaches that we take to provide the PERC learning. Here we provide a bit of context again of what resilience is and how we measure it. We look at it whether that can be used visually as well as in text form. And we provide then the timeline or the stepping stones how PERCs are being conducted, starting with the identification of a PERC event, then doing the desk research, so trying to understand as much as possible before you even venture out in the field what has happened and what has been written up about it. That also requires you to understand the physical conditions, to look a little bit into the event details and what has happened. You want to be able to contextualize that and frame that in the right way. Small events very locally can lead to devastating consequences, but you need to understand in that case that may be a very frequently reoccurring event, or it may have just been happening in a very vulnerable place. So this physical contextualization is relevant. Before you then venture out in the field and do the core of the PERC work in terms of seeing it for yourself, that's not to be underestimated, forming your own opinion, but also being able to access those organizations and institutions that hold the bulk of the knowledge. So this is really where you will need to identify, touch base with, and then interview or kind of get their knowledge out and written up as well. There's a bit of an interview guide, how to identify key people, who to interview them, and then also explaining a little bit, let's say, the enabling conditions that will help you conduct successful interviews. So here's a little bit of do's and don'ts, also in terms of getting both yourself and the interviewee in the right state of mind. This has a lot to do with trust and with highlighting that this is not a performance review, that this is not used to evaluate the performance of your interviewee, and definitely making sure that you intend by absolutely no means to do harm to them by saying, oh, Mr. Smith didn't really do their job and that's why this turned into this catastrophe as we see it. That's definitely not the intention and the feeling that we want to leave behind with these people. So very often it takes a little bit of an introduction, providing them with the prior information and prior examples of the PERCs that we have, so that they feel they can trust us with the information about what they're going to say. What's also important is the attribution. We typically do not directly attribute quotes or figures that we get to any individual interviewee, but what we try to do is really compile and anonymize the information, and obviously information gets more robust the more often you hear it from different sources. So if Mr. Smith and Ms. Jennings and Mr. Hyde and whoever are providing you the exact same information, then there is no need to attribute it to any single one of them, but you can really say that multiple sources from various actors and institutions have pointed to the fact that, and then you really have the good multiple source evidence base that you need also for your own credibility. And then it's very important that we always keep the option for the interviewee to talk and find a way out, so not cornering them and not follow up with, but you say this. And so this is not an interrogation, as much as I said that this is not a performance review, but it should really be a conversation where you prompt a little bit, where you dig a little bit. This is really interesting what you said. Can you elaborate a little bit more on, why you think the levee failed? Why you think there was a problem with the maintenance? Can you tell me what you learned? What are your thoughts? Do you have, some ideas about what you're going to do or what you already find out? And very often it's just simply asking, so are you doing an event review? And what are you trying to learn from this event? And as you're going then to discuss and interview many different sources, that's where your puzzle pieces will come together from all directions and all the various angles. So here's some guiding interview questions They're not seen as a list of things that you need to take into the interview and or absolutely ask. Again, it's just a guide that may help you be inspired, or also maybe the fallback safety net that you may need should you be out of ideas. So this is really a guide that you may consult during or for the preparation of your interviews. So then you want to ensure also that you're interviewing organizations equitably, fairly, and across those that are really the key institutions, so not missing one particular angle or particular corner of an important piece of the institutions that are operating in this space. You may also want to do this graphically, so you can see whether a full picture of who does what and who is active in the space is emerging. So we have tried to illustrate this in the case of Nepal, who is working on flood risk management at the international scale relevant for Nepal, at the national scale, and then the various actors in the various bits and pieces and how some of them interact and overlap by using arrows. So that's what we call an institutional landscape map. Just to do a little bit of sense checking, have I actually talked to volunteering organizations? Have I talked to local authorities and officers who have a say or have a role to play in local flood risk management? But how is this influenced by national level government and policies that are being, put in place relevant for this local action as well? So this is also the sense checking. Are you leaving any particular part of the picture out? As I said, a PERC is never complete. So you may work by the 80-20 rule that will guide you to what extent you need to get more information. It may also be simply that, you have 2 field works, weeks in the field work that you can invest, and you have used them all up, and that's the best that you can possibly do. Let's ensure we get the best picture out of this. So this is really the analysis of all that you were able to research so far and trying to put it all together. So this section of the PERC guide will help you provide a little bit of an advice and insight in how you can structure your notes, your findings and insights, and trying to make them logical as well as consistent and coherent. And then there's a small paragraph on conclusions, and there's references for further reading that will also identify for you where PERC is coming from and how it is different or similar to other forensic or non-forensic approaches that exist. Here's a timeline of an example how we look at an event in Nepal and how it materialized. And then that's really the origin of where PERC has started. So this was a full run-through of the PERC manual. And let me now go back to the main screen. And unmute all lines because this is the moment where really questions can and should be asked. So at this point, all lines should be open. Definitely, yes. And people are free now to ask any clarification questions before I will start wrapping up the presentation, and we can then use the extra time to really have more of a dialogue. So anybody, please feel free.
You are like the ideal. He doesn't feel like, yeah, he doesn't feel like he wants to.
So I hear a side conversation, but not necessarily a question. Are there any questions on the line?
Hi, Michael. This is Dan Gorham from IBHS. Can you hear me?
There is a lot of background, so let's see whether I can identify you or others can mute themselves. So please go ahead.
Hi, Michael. This is Dan. Thanks for the overview this morning. Like I had mentioned, I'm one of the IBHSers, Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. My colleague Faraz and I are on, and as you had mentioned earlier, that while this PERC has been set up for flood post-event, we're interested for post-wildfire events. And so my question is just kind of maybe based on your previous experiences. You talked about the fieldwork focus being that on interviews with those that had been in the area during the event, and just wanted to see if the PERC model worked with other types of data inputs, like data collection from a survey or damage inspection.
I would say yes, partially, but not exclusively. I think because PERC is forensic analysis, because it is subject to really holding conversations that will guide you to the next step, and so forth, I think a certain element of interacting with your stakeholders will be key. I think data and surveys and statistical analysis can help you to a certain extent. But then you would miss out on something if you didn't have a dialogue where you prompt your counterpart, okay, think about this. What does this mean? In this wider context, does that ring a bell for you? So I think data on its own is only partially important, and you would need to complement it by at least certain key data. The second thing that I would say is that, yes, we haven't done this with other perils thus far, but actually the wildfire thinking is advanced the most. One of our research colleagues from YASA, Adriana, based in Australia. Australia has wildfires. It's actually wildfire season as we speak. They're partnering with Australia and a research institute focusing on wildfires in Australia as well. Maybe we may be lucky or unlucky, in the sense that a big fire event may happen in Australia during this season. In a month or 2 months' time from now, we actually have a case where this is being conducted as a wildfire PERC, and obviously that's where you can touch base with them and get to know their experience in applying the PERC methodology to the wildfire peril.
Very good. Thank you.
Are there any other questions on the line?
Hey, Michael, this is Faraz Hedayati with IVHS. I have a question for you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Faraz. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. So we talked a lot about probability. Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean? Do you consider different aspects and make a likelihood function, or what do you mean by probability?
So the easiest would be if I could show you the probability, the flood probability explained on a napkin video that currently sits only, to my knowledge, within Zurich networks. I don't think you would have access to that, but I'll find a way of sharing that, maybe through a YouTube upload or something.
I appreciate you.
That would explain this, but effectively, yes. So very short, what you would do is look at all the dots on a XY chart that tells you how high was the water, how frequently. So, last year the top flood was this much, this many gallons second of water, etc. And that would give you a plot of a curve that you can then look at how often a certain flood stage is being seen. And that then, can be converted. Okay, this level of water is equivalent to 1 in 50 years. This is 1 in 500 years, etc. So it is a statistical equation with, all its scientific rigor. There's a lot of buts and caveats, but I'm happy to look into this to provide that to you.
I appreciate you.
Okay, then there's another question on the chat whether we can share the contact information. I will look into that if Adriana in Australia is happy at this point. It may be that the answer is we need to wait for a month or two until they actually are doing it. So at the moment they're at the conceptual stage. If there is a wildfire event in Australia, then we might dispatch, but also we might not. So I'm happy to look into this. Are there any other questions on the line? Then let me take 2 seconds to write down my follow-ups. What probabilities explained? and PERC Wildfire Australia contact. Right, thank
Michael?
you. Karen?
Michael, I'd be happy to talk with Dan and Faraz as well, just about kind of our preliminary thinking about how we can adapt this for fire and, you know, how do we deal with communities that no longer exist if we're looking for people to interview and that sort of thing.
Sounds good. Thank you, Karen, for that offer. So that was Karen McClune speaking from ISET.
And this is Dan. Karen, you really hit the nail on the head for some of the challenges that we face for wildfires, that the evidence can oftentimes be destroyed. So thanks for acknowledging that and looking forward to reaching out.
Great, thank you. Any other questions on the line at this point? If that is not the case, I will mute all the lines. And I will let you in on the homework. Hooray, exciting homework. So I think it's really important that you not just listen and try to digest what PERC is in a more theoretical or conceptual way, but that you really try to spend a little bit of time organizing yourself, conducting what we call a mini PERC. So the task is to select, work on, and present a mini PERC case study at the third webinar. And here's some of the bullet points that will provide you the necessary guidance of what we are expecting you to do. So the first is, as I said, any event is only interesting if it can provide some learning. So select a disaster or really any type of natural hazard event that had certain consequences that provide a potential for learning in your environment from your recent past. Recent is optional because typically that's easier to study. But if there is this one event that occurred 20 years ago but still provides an interesting case to dig out some of the learning, then of course that is acceptable as well. Ideally, it is a flood event that happened in your region, but of course, since some of your interests lie more with wildfires or maybe with flash flooding or just different processes of flooding, that is acceptable also. Then do a little bit of research on what this event was about and whether you can pause and say, so, aha, this is what has gone wrong. Here's kind of, an early evidence that I have doing the research why this event turned into an unexpected disaster. So doing that, try to develop 2 or 3 guiding questions that will help you start with your research. And some of the starting points would be, so what was new or what was surprising about this event that potentially promises some learning for you? So let this be your initial entry point for conducting the research. Then conduct the desk research, and the key to success of a forensic researcher is following your leads. You'll pick up a piece and you say, oh, so that's what it is. So this means I now need to find the next piece that is connected to this initial piece. So let yourself be guided by what you uncover as you start your puzzle and the picture starts emerging. So follow your leads, be guided by your gut feeling and by your expertise. We also suggest that you conduct at least 1 live interview. PowerPoint is not being shared. That is a good point. Apologies and thanks for providing the chat message. I did take a wrong turn there because I need to share my screen again. So now it is definitely shared. Thanks for bringing that up. So just quickly running through what was said so you can identify it on the list. Select your disaster event or any type of event that really might provide learning. Ideally, it's a flood event, but select something that interests you based on your expertise and the topic that you're working on. Develop your guiding research questions. So your entry point should be, so what was new in this? What's surprising about this event? And how can this lead to learning? And that should be your initial entry point that will provide the leads that you need to follow. So that's the detective work, finding the traces and following them. Ideally, you conduct at least one live interview. So prepare a bit of a, flexible questionnaire, your semi-structured interview questions, and then talk to somebody so that you just get familiar with what type of questions prompt what types of responses and whether these are the responses that will help you in putting the PERC puzzle pieces together. That may be a colleague, that has worked or is working in your department and knows about this event. It may be a relative that has lived through the event that affected them. But if you have good contacts, it may be, an official, an officer or likewise that you have access to. But please do outline in that case that this is really a training rather than a real research. As you do this, identify 2 or 3 key learnings in line with, this PERC ambition that we want to provide open source learning, linking the event and how it's turned into a disaster. So as you identify these 2 key 3 learnings, that's what will guide your presentation in webinar 3. So the outline is to prepare 3 slides. The first one, quickly contextualizing the event. So what are we looking at? The second one, distinguishing the key learnings from the third slide, which would then be the practical recommendations in the sense of a risk improvement advice or any kind of consultancy recommendation, what could be done to avoid next time this event turn into a disaster. You can work alone, or you can team up with a colleague if you're attending, 2 of you from a same or similar organization and you know each other. So work alone or in a pair. So this is what is being expected for you for webinar 3. Now let me briefly then outline again the PERC sequence, which will really be the starting point for webinar 2 at the end of the week. The starting point is, and that is really, understanding what's going on, being alerted either because you work in that geographic area or because your institution is interested in a particular peril and gets notified there is a big event for that peril taking place somewhere. So whether it's a big flood that you're alerted to by the media or there is a wildfire in your area, that would be the event identification. The question then is, so what's new? Is it just more of the same? Is this another river flood where we already, can expect to know what has turned this into a disaster? Or are there any new leads that create the knowledge that will, distinguish this PERC from some of the ones already conducted? You will then do over actually, typically weeks and months to come, depending on when your event happened and at what point it's actually safe to assume people have then time to talk to you, doing the desk research. So that's news articles, that may be, special interest reports, papers if the scientific community has already picked this up. So it's really understanding both this particular current event and the wider context flood history in that area. Because of course it does make a difference whether this is the 3rd flood in a row that has caused exactly or even more, of the same damages than compared to earlier floods. Excuse me. You then need to develop a hypothesis and your guiding questions that will be your initial lead. Based on this hypothesis, you will also do your institutional landscape and map to understand who are the key actors playing in this field and who are the key interview candidates that you should make appointments with and hopefully be allowed to interview. This is where the field work will start. So we'll go and visit the most affected areas. That could be any type of, group of people working together and going out into the field. Typically, that should be at least a 1 to 2 week endeavor if it's a sizable enough event. Again, it depends a little bit on the context and apparel that you're working on. But for comparison, the last couple of PERC studies that we have conducted was typically a team of 2 or 3 groups working from anywhere between 10 and I would say 14 or 15 days in the field to compile the evidence and the insights. Now, this is to create a sizable PERC product. So this was, I'm working then with national level media, national government and authorities to really highlight them to the fact that some significant learning has been produced out of this. That again may depend a little bit on who you're working for, what you're trying to achieve, and what your final product would be. So a smaller, very specific event that is relevant in maybe a smaller geography, and you have a very particular type of learning in mind that will lead to maybe a seminar or a town hall event. Obviously, your field research and your corresponding timing could look quite different. Here's a set of ideas to start off with in terms of conducting informal interviews. Government, local, regional, national level, across the disaster risk management cycle, for example. So we're also looking at the different authorities working at different focus fields in the disaster risk management. So you would want to talk to FEMA and national level, emergency management and response organizations as much as the local level, but maybe more long-term perspective state floodplain managers. Nonprofits are very important organizations, both in terms of how they try to protect and work with the natural environment, as much as dealing with vulnerable and marginalized groups that otherwise would not be taken care of. So these are the VOADs, these are the volunteering organizations, these may be the faith-based organizations and the like. It's obviously science and research. So, talk to local universities, talk to who you believe are the key expertise holders in that area. So the biggest wildfire experts might not be sitting in the wildfire area, but maybe it's a different national institution that holds this national level scientific information. And then simply talk to the people. Talk to people on the streets, talk to people in affected areas, talk to the SMEs, the small businesses, the mom and pop shops. That's where you will get a surprising amount of early leads that will guide you towards who has done what and why may this have been relevant in the chain of events unfolding. And that will then help you deconstruct why a natural hazard turned into a humanitarian disaster. So going back to this mantra that there is no such thing as a natural disaster, something unnatural in the sense of humans taking either conscious or unconscious decisions has happened that made the event turn into a disaster. And that's how you will then write up your findings and provide your product, your learning product. So at this point, we're 2 hours into the webinar, so I think we've made good head time, not too superficial and too swiftly, but hopefully also not too boring, too conceptually, and too slow. So again, at this point, I will stop the screen sharing and we'll go back to unmuting participants. The last time we tried this just 10 minutes ago, there was quite a bit of background noise. So just me unmuting all doesn't mean that then people shouldn't mute themselves if they are in a noisy environment. So unmuting all means you will be unmuted unless you're using a device that you can mute irrespective of this. Please just double check if you're causing background noise and then mute yourself individually as you're not speaking. But lines are open at this point in time. And right away, we do have quite a bit of echo. So if people could look into this a little bit. But let's use this now for more also informal discussions and where questions may be. And I'm also looking towards my co-presenters and co-facilitators, Rachel, Kanmani, and Karen, if at this point in time you want to add things where I may have gone off track. So, so far, thank you again already for listening, and please bring up any doubts, concerns, or questions that you have at this point.
Hey, Michael.
Yes?
Hi, Bart Shack now in New York with Reese May.
Good morning, Bart and Reese.
Morning.
Can you send this updated PowerPoint presentation to everyone? The initial one that you sent out, I don't think was as extensive as this, or you've made some additions and enhancements to this. Can you send out this version?
I am more than happy to send this version, and then, you know, as the other slide decks are building onto the session of this first webinar, we'll send them after the respective webinars as well.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Bart. Are there any questions or concerns on the line?
Hi, Michael. This is Dan Gorm again from IBHS. Can you hear me?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, and apologies for dominating the conversation, but this is all very interesting. And just a kind of a quick question that you alluded to at the end. You talked about the field work and the duration in the field, and that usually you said, I think, maybe somewhere between 3 to 4 teams. And just a sense for some of the previous experience you've had, one of the perceived challenges that we have is different people, individuals collecting data differently, and again, just some initial thoughts that you've had with that, or if that's going to come up later on in the webinar series, feel free to punt it and wait until then.
So I think that's an interesting point. And maybe Kanmani, if you want to take a note, I think that would be very appropriate in the detailed fieldwork discussions and how do you work actually together as a diverse team in the field. You know, how we can address that. My experience is really PERC fieldwork is never clean. So I think, you know, while I appreciate the fact that different teams and different people will work and do the investigations differently already, based on what you find and how you get these golden nuggets of learnings from your interviewees, that in itself is already messy. So it's really, you know, then sitting down at the end of the day with different research teams and collectively throw on the table what you have found. And obviously it is a forensic team effort in the sense that somebody may have discovered a lead that they don't understand until, you know, one of the other team members points out something based on something they have identified, seen or heard. And I think that's actually part of the exciting part of trying to make sense of the mess, you know, simply speaking. And for us, that very often were, you know, kind of wrap-up conversations we've had in a coffee shop, that were dinner conversations where we sat down at the end of the day jointly, depending on how your base camp in the field is organized, just, you know, doing joint cooking really and talking about the experiences of the day. So it's really, you know, the soft skills and the elements of, you know, discussing and talking to each other where this will be coming together. So it's not a clean if-then advice that I can give here, but really just, you know, the team sitting down and, you know, what have you done today? Oh, this is really interesting. So tell me more because I have heard this and you have heard that. And what does this mean for our next couple of days?
Yeah, I would just add to that, Dan. This is Karen from ISET, that actually we've found that if we have teams with fairly diverse skills, that it's an advantage because we come at questions from different perspectives, and it really makes the results much richer than if we all came in from one perspective, from, you know, social vulnerability or risk engineering, or it's bringing together those different strands. But you know, and we can certainly dive into it more in webinar 2, but we generally think about who do we have on what teams doing interviews, what are their skill sets, and consequently, how do we divide up our interview targets so that, you know, if we have an engineer that's doing, that we're going to talk to about physical infrastructure, physical protection infrastructure, that we send someone who has a skill set that can really dig into that. Whereas if we're interviewing a nonprofit doing humanitarian relief, or we're going to a meeting where we know that there will be members of a vulnerable community kind of presenting their issues and needs, that we have someone that's coming more from the social vulnerability side that can really dig into those questions more deeply.
Very good. Thank you both.
Sure. Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Daniel. Are there any follow-up questions or kind of, issues related to conducting field work and working together as a team? So if you just, working on this topic, any other comments or thoughts that you want to add? If that is not the case, then let's go back to more, general questions and maybe another different topic altogether. Are there any other concerns or questions participants on the line might have? Okay, maybe not so much at this point. So let's see if that changes as we go into webinar 2 then at the end of the week, as people start hopefully, shuffling through the PERC manual, thinking about how they could team up with a teammate and conducting their own mini PERC homework. I'm sure more questions or thoughts will come up as we go along. So my assumption would be that we don't need to keep everyone on the line if there's nothing more to discuss. My view is that we covered a lot of ground and we're able to go through the content that we have foreseen for this very first webinar. But before I promise to close early and send off everybody, let's just review with Karen, Rachel, and Kanmani whether there's anything else that you want to add. And in fact, maybe Kanmani and Rachel, you want to introduce yourself and explain a little bit what people can expect following on from this webinar in the next one on Friday.
We didn't get Kanmani on the call this morning. She had a visa appointment that she needed to deal with.
Okay.
But Rachel, can you jump in?
Yep. Sorry. Hi, this
Hi,
is Rachel. I was trying to figure out how to unmute. Yeah, so I am from ISET as well, and I will be doing some of the talking on webinar number 2. So this is the voice you will all be hearing. And one question I had, Michael, if people are reviewing kind of their notes from today or looking at the PERC manual, I'm wondering if they could maybe feel free to send either you or me any questions they might have that we could integrate into webinar number 2. I don't have everybody's contact info, but that might be a good way for us to just keep continuity between webinar 1 and 2 as well.
Absolutely, this is an excellent suggestion. Thanks for bringing this up. So if people have any questions that they can already see arising, rather than just ask them during webinar 2, if you could send them in just loosely via email to me ahead of time, I'm happy to compile those and share with colleagues so we are prepared for these to cover during webinar 2.
Thank you.
Anything that you want to add, Rachel, also in view of how this will lead over to the second webinar, based on also the outline we've provided at the very beginning of the day?
Nothing too specific, I guess. We will, again, as Michael said, we'll be updating the slides for webinar 2, so we'll make sure everybody has those updated slides. I think our main goal for this is, for Friday's webinar, is to dig more into the actual methodology, so the field work and the interviews, just go into a little bit more specifics. Michael gave you kind of a brief overview going through the manual, so just thinking about that, if there's any questions as you're going through the manual pertaining to that, just send them our way. Karen, is there anything else you can think of for webinar 2 that would be helpful to touch on now?
And the other piece that we'll be discussing is just how do you conduct, you know, some number of very open-ended interviews which are supported by background research, and then take what ends up being a quite substantial body of evidence and winnowing it down to those key learnings. And so just the steps that we use in the analysis we'll also be discussing.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Any other additions? Also think about this being now the last opportunity of asking questions on this call and webinar. Everything else, please send in via email if you discover questions or concerns ahead of time. And then, of course, there is time built in for questions and answers in the second webinar as well. But before we close, if you have any other questions that have just come up, this is now the last round of questions. There seem to be none. Then I would thank you all for your interest and patience in bearing with us, explaining why this webinar, the first steps in becoming PERC trained. I hope you found this reasonably useful, and I look forward to continuing on your journey with our fantastic facilitators we'll have at the next webinar on Friday. If I could, before everybody drops off, just have those maybe remain on the line for a couple of minutes who intend to come into the field with us. At this point, I have not yet clarity what PERC Florence, what the team builds up of the research team for PERC Florence would be. So if you don't mind just staying on the line quickly and explain that, that would help me a great deal in understanding what to expect. So I'm also particularly looking to the Zurich guys in Schaumburg and in New York and DC to hopefully help me out with this. Other than that, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you. I hope you find this useful, and talk to you soon.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
And I will stop the recorder at this point so that we can just have the follow-on discussion.
All right, are we done?